This is Adria from Oceanside, California, and you are listening to California Dreaming on Orbital Jigsaw Network.
Okay, dreamers, it is Friday morning, and I am trying to get this out to you as soon as possible. So hopefully it will be by the end of today. This is the second part of our two-part series entitled The Tale of Righting Our Wrongs. If you have not yet listened to part 1, pause this here and listen to episode 120 first so you can be up to speed with where we're at. In part 1, we went over the circumstances surrounding the March 10th, 1983 murder of suburban wife and mother, Dorka Lisker. She and her husband of 36 years, Bob, at the time, they had a 17-year-old adopted son, Bruce, who quickly became the focal point of the investigation. Because of his history of substance abuse and troubles getting along with his parents, Bruce appeared to be a likely suspect. All the investigator on the case needed to do was prove it. But would he be able to? Was the evidence there enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bruce was the killer? Were other suspects thoroughly investigated and eliminated? Let's get into the remainder of the story and see if we can answer these questions. We left off with Bruce and his dad coming to the decision that their best course of action might be to just go ahead and plead guilty in juvenile court. That way, Bruce would be able to serve a minimal amount of time and be home in just a matter of about 5 years or so. Ultimately, their goal for both Bruce and Bob would be for Bob to live long enough to see Bruce free again someday. While Bruce was awaiting trial, something else happened. He was visited by a battery of psychologists in order for them to have a chance to speak to him and make a determination as to what would be the best direction to go in dealing with him. He was only 17, so there were 2 possible ways for him to go. Bruce could be sent to the juvenile system, where he would be dealt with under those guidelines, or he could be sent through the adult system and dealt with under those standards in prosecuting adult offenders, which is much, much worse. And these psychologists came to the conclusion that Bruce was an extremely violent person who demonstrated to them absolutely no remorse for the crime for which he was being accused, and they gave their opinion to the court that it was their recommendation that the court not send Bruce to a juvenile detention center. He was much too dangerous and needed to be housed with adults. And with that recommendation, the court decided to remand the case to the adult system. The plan that Bruce and his father had discussed, pleading guilty in juvenile court and accepting a sentence of 5 years or so, was no longer an option for him. A guilty plea would have meant many, many more years in prison. So he officially withdrew his guilty plea and pleaded not guilty instead. The prosecutor in Bruce's case was a man named Philip Rabichow, and he was convinced from day one that Bruce Lisker was absolutely guilty of murdering his mom. Now, I want you to remember Philip Rabichow because much later on, towards the end of this episode, he is going to reappear in our story, and he's going to be a very important component in all of this. So like Detective Monsu, Rabichow believed that Bruce's account of what happened that morning were all lies, and his most important witness, Monsu himself, would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bruce was guilty. At trial, there were a few key crucial elements of his testimony that were pivotal in the prosecution's case against Bruce. For starters, Monsu testified at trial that there was no possible way that Bruce Lisker could have peered into any window of the home and been able to see his mom lying on the floor near the hallway. He testified that he himself looked in all the windows and that the glare of the sun would have made it completely impossible for Bruce to see anything because it obscured the view from outside. And to demonstrate this to the court, Mansu entered into evidence a picture that he took of the window showing that it had an effect that was more like a mirror as opposed to a window because the glare of the sun was so predominant. So Bruce's claim that he came knocking on the door, got no answer, and decided to go around the back of the house and look inside the windows was a lie. He did not discover his mom lying in the floor by looking in. He knew that she was on the floor because he was the one who put her there. So if you consider Bruce's story from the moment that he supposedly found his mom as being a lie, then everything else that followed must be a lie as well. The jury was basically told, you cannot believe a word that this guy is saying. He killed his mom, and he's lying about it to save his own skin. So the prosecutor laid it out fairly simply. Bruce was there at the scene, he had the opportunity, and the reason he did it, the motive was one as old as time: greed, money. He went over there because he was desperate for money to buy more drugs. The visit to his mom's house escalated into an argument, and this argument escalated into a confrontation between son and mother, and Bruce escalated that to murder. The $150 that Dorka had in her purse that Bob had given her the evening before was missing. And according to the prosecutor, Bruce robbed his mom of this $150 and began his cover-up. Okay, so Detective Mansu must have found this money on Bruce, right? I mean, he went over there, he asked his mom for money, she refused, he killed her, robbed her, then called 911. So they found the money in Bruce's wallet? Nope. They found it in his pocket? They found it in his sock? No. In his car? Nope. Someplace on the property? No. Buried in the yard? Nope. The fact is, investigators never found the money, nor were they ever able to account for it. So if you ask Prosecutor Rabichow, where did the money go? He would tell you that it was hidden someplace where they were unable to find it, and it was hidden by Bruce Lisker. If you want to know where the money went, you'd have to get those answers from him, and he's not saying. And I've already gone over how I feel about this supposed money motive earlier, and how it didn't make any sense to me that Bruce would want to rob his mom since she and Bob were the ones giving him everything he needed to live. But that didn't matter to Detective Mansu or Prosecutor Rabichow. They simply went for the easy, convenient suspect. Bruce had always asserted that there was another person inside his parents' house that day, and it was someone who either broke into the home or forced his way in order to rob his mom and ended up killing her. There was one set of bloody footprints, and Mansu and Rabichow maintained that it was Bruce Lisker who left those footprints. They were a perfect match to the shoes he was wearing, they said. And that was a key point in the prosecution's case. Absolutely crucial. There were no other shoe prints anywhere in the house, only Bruce's. If you want to believe his story that someone else did this murder, then where are their footprints? There aren't any, because Bruce was the only one in the home, not some unknown intruder. He was the one who left the prints because he was the one in there murdering his mother. Bruce's trial lasted 3 weeks. After closing arguments, the case was handed over to the jury. They spent 3 days deliberating and would come back with a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder. The judge subsequently sentenced Bruce to 16 years to life in prison. And time wore on. Bruce would turn 18 in jail. He became an adult. And as each appeal he filed was denied time and time again, Bruce never gave up. He had nothing but time and space to be all consumed with his ordeal. He insisted to anyone who would listen he was the wrong person sitting in prison for his mother's murder. And his dad, Bob, Dad never wavered in his belief and faith in his son. He never stopped believing in his innocence. Bruce said in an interview with CBS that he called his dad every single day at 10 in the morning, every day over the course of 13 years. Until one day in 1995, as Bruce was making his usual call to his dad's office, his administrative assistant answered the phone, and she broke the devastating news to Bruce that his dad had suffered a heart attack and he was gone at the age of 69. The only person Bruce felt as though he had left in the world was no longer with him. It was one of the lowest points of Bruce's life. Bob did leave something behind for Bruce that would hopefully help him fight on after his death. About $185,000. Bruce's options were running out, but at the very least, he had the resources to try and explore what little left there was for him. So without too many other directions to go, Bruce decided to put his money to use by taking his chances on a man named Paul Ingalls. Now, my dreamers, if you hearken back to the Kevin Cooper episodes, you may recall that we brought up the name Paul Ingalls in his case as well. He had actually been involved in the manhunt for Cooper when he was on the run for the couple months following the murders of the Ryan family and Christopher Hughes. After Paul Ingalls got out of law enforcement, he went into working as a private investigator. And it was the matriarch of the Ryan family, the grandmother of Josh Ryan, the lone survivor, Mary Howell, who also hired and befriended Paul Ingalls to look into the case further, because Mary herself had strong doubts that Kevin Cooper was the one who murdered her daughter, her son-in-law, and her granddaughter. And if you recall, Paul Ingalls ended up pulling out of the investigation after further DNA testing of some of the evidence in the case came back as a match to Kevin Cooper. That was sort of the make or break piece of evidence for him, and he came to believe that the right person was in prison for that massacre in Chino Hills. So yes, that is the same Paul Ingalls that Bruce here now has hired to help him. Paul was an ex-police officer, so he is not quick to just assume that the person who is hiring him must be innocent, as they might want to claim that they are. He is interested in taking a fresh look at all of the evidence in a case and going in with an open mind and being willing to accept what the evidence tells him. And in speaking to Bruce and taking an initial cursory look at the case, it seemed pretty simple. If you're going to take the word of what Detective Monsu had to say about the case and testified to at trial on the stand, then yes, Bruce is totally guilty. But Paul wasn't just going to stop there and assume that anything is true without getting a first-hand look at the physical evidence. And he started with a t-shirt that investigators testified in court was covered in blood spatter. Paul got a picture of the shirt. He looked at it, and there was no blood on it. Really? Because Detective Monsu said there was blood all over it. It was covered in blood. But when it was tested, there was not a single drop of blood anywhere on it. The t-shirt had a few grease stains on it. Grease from Bruce working on his Mustang, which he said he needed some tools from his parents' house to finish working on that morning. How is it that this Detective Monsu is going around telling people that there's blood on a t-shirt that clearly has not a speck of blood on it? The reality of what Paul Ingalls was finding out about Monsu dropped on him like a ton of bricks. That Monsu, he was the liar, not Bruce. He lied about the blood, so what else in this case had he lied about? And if he has absolute proof that Monsu lied in the case that he built all those years ago against Bruce, then there is a great possibility that Bruce might actually be innocent of this crime that he's been convicted of. And by this time, he'd been sitting in prison for 16 years. But this was not going to be an easy task, making the case for Bruce's innocence. It was a huge mountain to climb. You've got Bruce here convicted of murdering his mom. In his corner, the only person in his corner is a private investigator that he's hired to figure out this puzzle for him. And it's the two of them against the Goliath that is the Los Angeles Police Department. But from the moment Paul Ingalls found no blood on that t-shirt that Monsu had said had blood on it, he was in this for as long as it would take. He immediately invested everything he had into finding the truth. And as he went along, it was like all the lies that were told on the part of the investigators, and because of them, the lies that were told by the prosecutor on the case, they all just came flying at Paul from every direction. It was like lie after lie after lie that was used to manufacture this case against Bruce with the sole purpose of winning, and absolutely no consideration for seeking the truth or justice for Dorka Lisker. But Bruce and Paul, they actually had an incredible stroke of luck as they worked towards trying to prove Bruce's innocence. They found someone in the Los Angeles Police Department that actually heard what they were saying. He was listening to them. He was moved by what they were telling him. His name was Sergeant Jim Gavin. And most important of all, he believed them. And dreamers, you have to understand, Jim Gavin is a man who would live and die by the LAPD. He was 1,000% all about his department, fully committed to his job, absolutely believed in the work that he and they did without a moment of doubt that any one of his fellow officers could or would do wrong. And I know you and me, knowing what we know about the LAPD and the long history of corruption and malfeasance, scoff at the notion that the LAPD could do no wrong. But they live by their code, right? They are a brotherhood, a fraternity. You don't stray from that. You don't betray your fellow officers. Well, my friends, Sergeant Gavin has been one of those. His entire career. That is until he met Bruce Lisker and Paul Ingalls. They would forever change the way he would feel about the LAPD and his fellow officers. And I can't imagine that was an easy place for himself to be, doubting his very own department. From the time Paul was hired by Bruce to take a look into his case to try and find the truth, it really didn't take very long for Paul to begin to believe that Bruce might actually be innocent. And as the years passed, he would only become even more convinced of it. But in order to truly get to the heart of it, and more importantly, to be able to prove to a judge who would be willing to listen to what he had to say, he was going to need to get his hands on all of the evidence that was collected from the scene of the crime that day of the murder. And all that stuff was sitting somewhere in an LAPD evidence locker, collecting dust, probably deep, dark down in the bowels of the basement of the LAPD headquarters. And Paul would even admit that there were many a night that he would lay wide awake thinking about that evidence and how he was going to gain possession of it. And it was on one of those nights that he lay there ruminating about what to do or which direction to go that he kind of came up with a really off-the-wall plan. Working from the standpoint that he strongly believed that the lead detective on the case, Detective Andrew Monsu, conducted himself in a manner that was quite unbecoming, and by unbecoming, I mean that he lied. There was at least one instance where Paul knew that Monsu had presented evidence to the court that was not true, that Bruce's shirt had blood spatter on it that was indicative of him having been in close proximity to the victim while she was being bludgeoned. And Paul knew damn well that those were not bloodstains, but rather grease stains. Monsu testified under oath that it was blood. This is falsifying evidence, and so Paul decided to launch a formal complaint with the LAPD that Monsu did in fact falsify evidence in Bruce's murder case. Kind of a long shot? Yeah, totally. All you can do is hope that the LAPD is going to receive the complaint and decide that they are interested enough to want to take a closer look at what their officer is being accused of. I mean, who knows how many people have actually filed this sort of complaint against an officer in the department. But the fact that the complaint is being made by a convicted murderer, you have to wonder if they're really going to want to dig into the complaint. Or are they going to blow it off? Because really, what is all this based on? Something real and valid? Or just a convict with a lot of time on his hands trying to work his way out of prison? Well, for Paul, it was worth a try because you really never know who's going to see that complaint and be curious enough to start reading. It's the only thing that he could think of that would enable him to get the evidence in Bruce's case. And so enter Jim Gavin into our story. I mentioned him a minute ago. He had been working as an officer with the LAPD for 17 years. And like I said, he is a cop that bleeds blue. And at the time Paul filed the complaint on behalf of Bruce, Sergeant Gavin was working in internal affairs. It was his job to look into just the kind of allegations that Bruce and Paul were making against Monsu. Police misconduct. So when he received this complaint, that's exactly what he did. He began examining the instances of misconduct that they were accusing Monsu of. And I don't think Paul or Bruce could have gotten any luckier when it came to who received their filing. Sergeant Gavin believed in the integrity and honor and pride that the LAPD is supposed to stand for. And if there was any inkling that anything short of that was going on in his department, he wanted to find it, figure it out, and make it right. And like I said, we can imagine that Sergeant Gavin received lots of complaints from convicted criminals sounding like broken records, that they didn't do it. It wasn't them. It was somebody else. They're innocent. Blah, blah, blah. I'm sure that he's heard it all. But Paul's complaint on behalf of Bruce was accompanied by documents that actually backed up what he was alleging. So it gave Sergeant Gavin pause. It was much more than the typical "I didn't do it" filing that he normally received. And contained with Bruce's complaint was a document that really stood out when Sergeant Gavin looked over the filing. You see, 15 years after Dorka was murdered, Bruce had an opportunity to be up for parole in 1998. Let me pause here to point out that this was not the first time that Bruce went up for parole. The first time was in 1992, and he took a chance at telling the parole board what they wanted to hear. That he had a drug problem, that he stole money from his parents, that he was quickly spiraling downward, that his life was on a destructive path, and it all resulted in him murdering his mom. He tried to accept responsibility, he tried to express remorse, but he was denied parole. From there, Bruce had made the decision that he would never do that again. He would not stand there and admit that he killed his mom in the hopes that it would win his freedom. His next 3 parole hearings, Bruce refused to attend, until finally relenting in 1999, appearing before the parole board to proclaim his innocence while also retracting his previous statements from 1992 parole hearing. For Bruce, with now both his mom and his dad gone, and his dad having been the one who was really advocating for him tirelessly, Bruce could only rely on what he knew to be the truth. The parole board expects the defendant to express some level of sorrow and remorse for their crimes, which is something Bruce simply wasn't going to do again, because he's been adamant that he did not do this. And he was denied parole again, so it was time to focus on proving his truth that he didn't do this. But back to the document from the 1998 parole hearing that Sergeant Gavin found. When Bruce was up for parole that year, Detective Monsu submitted a letter to the parole board, and this was one that Bruce did not attend. Clearly, Monsu's interest is in keeping the person he investigated, arrested, and charged with Dorka's murder in prison for as long as possible, for life if he could. So in the interest of that, Monsu submitted a letter to the board. And a component of the letter included an update as to the money that was missing from Dorka's purse. Are you listening to this, dreamers? Because this is actually pretty astonishing. If you recall, the day before Dorka was murdered, her husband Bob had given her $150 to do some grocery shopping and whatnot, and that money was never accounted for. It was presumed to have been stolen by the person who killed Dorka, and that person was believed to have been Bruce, at least according to Detective Monsu. But he had never been able to say or prove what Bruce had done with that money. Well, in Detective Monsu's letter to the parole board, he wrote that subsequent to the investigation and Bruce's conviction, sometime in the years since, he has been able to prove that it was Bruce that stole that $150 from his mom. How did he do that? Well, let me tell you. Detective Monsu said that the people who purchased the Lisker home after Bob's death, the new homeowners, somehow made contact with Monsu and told him that they discovered the money tucked away someplace in the attic. Okay, I'm going to stop right here and discuss the absolute ridiculousness of this statement right here. Now, I'm not 100% sure when the new homeowners purchased the Lisker home, but it actually really doesn't matter if it was Bob who was the one that sold them the home or if it was sold after his death. But the fact is that it was sold to a man named Mort Borenstein. First of all, was Mort told about the killing that occurred in the home? Well, in California, you only have to disclose a death that took place in the home, whether it was a peaceful death or a violent death, only if it happened within 3 years of when the house is to be sold. It's possible that Mort was told, but highly unlikely, especially if it was sold after Bob's death, which occurred 13 years after Dorka's. And what if Mort was looking through the attic and discovered $150 stashed somewhere up there? Is he going to call the police and report that he found this money hidden in the home? I mean, how is it that Detective Monsu would have come into this information unless Mort specifically went through the trouble of seeking him out to tell him? Is that a thing that would have happened? Mort would have had to have known that law enforcement would be interested in knowing about this $150 find, right? Otherwise, what would Mort have done? I know what he would have done. He would have been like, oh, cool, lucky me, I found $150, let's go shopping. Reporting valuables discovered in a purchased home doesn't seem like a thing most people would do. You bought the house, and if someone leaves anything behind, unless they come and ask for it, well then, the new homeowner is most likely going to keep it. Okay, so what if we look at an alternative scenario? What if that $150 had been eating away at Detective Monsu for years after the case had long been adjudicated? What if it was the one aspect of Bruce's case that he couldn't get over and decided one day that he needed to find out if it had ever been discovered? Theoretically speaking, as Monsu is of the belief that Bruce robbed and killed his mother, because they were unable to find the missing money, then Bruce must have hidden it someplace in the house where police were going to be unlikely to find it. So what if Monsu one day decided that he needed to close the chapter on this once and for all and the only way to do that would be to figure out where that money was hidden. So he took it upon himself to return to the scene of the crime sometime later, and in speaking to the new owners of the home, explained the situation and told them that he wanted to know or to be notified if they ever ran across the $150. And lo and behold, the new owners either said, "Oh yeah, we found that exact amount of money hidden in the attic," or they contacted Mansu at a later time and informed him, yes, they did indeed run across the hidden money. And that information was finally able to give Mansu a measure of closure when it came to his desire to tie up all of the loose ends involved here in Bruce's case. Is that plausible? Yeah, it could have happened that way. There are often certain aspects of a case that bother detectives for their entire careers. Those things that they can't let go or they can't get over. Maybe for Mansu, this was his thing. Could be, right? Well, there's a big, huge problem with that. Mort Borenstein has absolutely no recollection of ever speaking to Detective Mansu about any money, nor does he have any recollection of ever finding any money in the attic of the home. Mr. Borenstein spoke to CBS in an interview about it, and he said, "It's not easy to want to accuse a police officer of lying, but that's kind of where this story has ended up." Mort knows what he knows. What motivation in the world would he have to be untruthful about whether or not he found $150 in the attic, or whether or not he ever spoke to a detective about it? Heck, if anything, it'd be a great story for Mort to tell his friends and family and his grandkids how he solved the mystery of the long-lost $150. That $150 was not a huge sum of money then, and it's even less today. But to a desperate for money, drug-addicted teenager, $150 could go a long way. It was the motive. It was the only motive for Dorka's murder. Putting that money in Bruce's hands would have shut down any lingering doubt about this case once and for all. Detective Mansu knew that, and he went way out of his way to tie up that loose end at Bruce's parole hearing. Essentially, it was the only loose end. Well, did Mansu collect the money from Mort Borenstein? According to Mort, the two men never spoke, nor did he ever run across the money Mansu claimed in his letter to the parole board. But did Mansu take $150 and book it into evidence? I mean, that would surely clear up any lingering doubts, right? If there was $150 contained within Bruce's case file, it would be easy to check the years and the serial numbers of the bills to see if they were consistent from being bills from around that period of time in the early 80s, right? Sergeant Gavin looked. The $150 was never booked into evidence. If Mansu had written that he was told about the money but actually did not get the money, then okay. Maybe there would be no money to be booked into evidence. But if Mansu had been told by Mort that they found the money, which leads me to think that Mort knew that the money was something that he needed to report to the police because they were interested in knowing that it had been found, then we can assume that Mort would have turned the money over to police too if he had gone out of his way to actually contact them. He would not have been able to report the money to Mansu and have been able to keep it, especially if there was an indication that it was important evidence in a crime. The bottom line is this. No matter which way you look at this money that Mansu wrote to the parole board in 1998 that he was told by the new owners of the Lisker home that they had found hidden in the attic, the fact is that there is no evidence that any of this ever took place. What this means is the likely scenario is that this was a convoluted attempt on Mansu's part to close up the biggest hole in the case against Bruce Lisker, the missing money. I guess maybe he thought nobody would ever question his report. nobody would ever look into his investigation through a microscope. The average person looking at the case he put together against Bruce would believe that on the surface, the guy seemed guilty. Monsoon said Bruce could not have seen the inside of the house through the windows. Monsoon said Bruce entered the home in a manner that was more indicative of someone trying to sneak into the house as opposed to someone frantically trying to get in to save his mother's life. Monsoon said that the shoe prints throughout the house matched Bruce's shoes. And now, 15 years later at the parole hearing, Monsoon is saying that the money Bruce stole from his mother was now accounted for. It was hidden in the attic of the Lisker home, and that Bruce hid it there in a panic because he knew that if they found the money on him, he would be caught for sure. Everything Bruce was convicted on were all things that Monsoon said. And there he was 15 years later, still saying things to try and make sure this case sticks. Honestly, Monsoon would have been better off if he would have just gone on with his life after Bruce went to jail and never gave it a second thought. He didn't have to write that letter to the parole board. It's hard to say what Monsoon actually thought when it came to Bruce's guilt or innocence. He might have wanted to believe his own lies so badly. He simply forced himself into believing them and made up stories to help it fit. But I can't help but think that there must have been some part of Monsoon that thought the case against Bruce was weak. He must have known some, if not all, of what he had to say about Bruce and his involvement was mostly, if not all, untrue. If Monsoon was confident in the case that was presented at trial that it was airtight, why would he have felt compelled to come forward 15 years after the fact with the answer to the biggest unknown in the case? What happened to the missing money? He did it most likely because he knew his case was shaky. And most of all, I think he did it because he needed to be right, and he needed to stay right. He knew his case was flimsy, so he needed to keep coming back to keep proving that he was right. And to what end? He got a 17-year-old kid convicted of murder on questionable evidence. He got the 16 years to life in prison. 15 years in, and this kid is now a man up for parole, and yet it still wasn't enough for Detective Monsoon. He had to keep coming back with more untruths in order to prevent Bruce from gaining his freedom. How many years would have been enough for Detective Monsoon? 20 years? 30? 40? How much punishment is enough for a 17-year-old convicted on shaky evidence and questionable investigation? And you know what, dreamers? I put a lot of responsibility for this on Monsoon based on what we know thus far about the investigation, and trust me, there's more. But he also had the full support of the powers that be at the LAPD. Bruce Lisker was a real issue for the department. Every single one of them knew the implications of what this would mean for the LAPD if this were ever thoroughly investigated and the word got out that this level of misconduct was going on and being covered up. Bruce Lisker needed to stay in prison, hopefully until he was dead. His life didn't matter. Protecting the integrity and the reputation of the LAPD was more important than Bruce Lisker. And even some of their own officers. And we will get to that. So, just as I have explained why this letter to the parole board from Monsoon sounded so ridiculous to me, it was a curious aspect of the case to Sergeant Gavin as well, investigating all of this. It simply didn't make sense as to how it all came to be. Mort Borenstein denies that he ever found $150 or that he ever talked to Detective Monsoon about it, and Monsoon never booked the money into evidence. What all this was adding up to as far as Sergeant Gavin was concerned that it was quite possible that Monsu may have presented a false report to the parole board reviewing Bruce's case. And that is a huge problem. One of the worst problems here. A cop that is lying. And if he's being untruthful here in this instance, then what else has he lied about? Especially when you think of the decades that Monsu was an officer with the LAPD. The only thing Sergeant Gavin could do now was take a look at the other aspects of the case and the investigation to see if the evidence against Bruce would or could stand the test of time. One of the most damning pieces of evidence presented at Bruce's trial involved the bloody footprint evidence. The prosecuting attorney, Rabichow, he told the jury, "You see all these footprints all over the house, and all of them are a match to Bruce Lisker's shoe prints. If it was truly someone else who killed Dorka Lisker, if someone else was in that house that day, then where are their bloody footprints? There aren't any, because Bruce was the only one at the scene, and he's the only one who could have committed this crime." Well, in looking through the case file, Sergeant Gavin came to find that the bloody footprints had never been analyzed to see if they were an exact match to Bruce's shoes that he was wearing at the time that he was taken into custody. Nobody ever did any shoe print analysis testing on any of the prints. None of them. So how is it that Monsu was able to get on the stand and say that those bloody prints were made by Bruce Lisker and only Bruce Lisker? The answer is that he shouldn't have. And maybe there is no record of the shoes and shoe prints having been analyzed. But then again, who's to say that they were tested, and when the results came back and they didn't match, they decided to keep that information to themselves instead of doing the right thing by following what the evidence was telling them, that this wasn't Bruce that did this, and to disclose that information to the defense. They didn't do that. Instead, Monsu went on the stand and testified that the shoe prints matched Bruce's shoes. That's it. He just said it, and they took his word for it. So Sergeant Gavin did what should have been done all those years earlier. He had the evidence analyzed by the LA County Crime Lab, and the results were that their analysis of the prints excluded Bruce as being the one who left the bloody footprints. Sergeant Gavin called up Paul Ingalls and told him the results, which was quite an extraordinary moment for him. As an investigator, being able to come up with this sort of solid, irrefutable physical evidence was truly astonishing. Paul ran the gamut of emotions as he let this information sink in. Not only does it validate what Bruce had been saying all along, but it also confirms what he had come to strongly believe was a frame-up job by the LAPD against Bruce. And the fact that it came from an actual LAPD lab, it couldn't get any better than that. And how was all of this sinking in for Sergeant Gavin? The man who believed with all his heart and soul in the Los Angeles Police Department, the thing that he loved and cared about most, second only to his wife and children? What is this information doing to him, and how does he feel about his beloved department? He found himself in a place where he was going to have to accept the reality that his department may have really convicted the wrong man for this crime. And not only that, but the case was being manipulated and manufactured to fit that they wanted it to. After all these years, the truth was starting to be revealed. Maybe. So as Paul Ingalls and Sergeant Gavin are starting to come to the realization that Bruce Lisker's assertions all these years that he was innocent might actually be true, they still have to wonder about one big, huge question in the case of the murder of Dorka Lisker. Who was responsible for bludgeoning and stabbing her to death? Well, in part 1, we brought up the young man that Bruce had befriended and invited to live with him for a short period of time in 1982, Mike Ryan. Detective Mansu sort of investigated Mike early on in the investigation. And I don't want to say that Mansu eliminated him as a suspect because I don't think he actually ever did that. Mansu kind of decided that his initial opinion that Bruce was the one who killed Dorka was the right opinion. And there was nothing Mike Ryan told him or even admitted to that would change his mind. And there is actually a recording of Mansu interviewing Mike Ryan where he confronts him about lying about his alibi, but still, somehow, he just decided to let that go and continue to pursue Bruce. And I'll get to that interview shortly. Both Bruce and his dad, Bob, implored Detective Monsoon to investigate Mike Ryan. Talk to him. There were not just one or two things that should have landed Mike at the top of the suspect list from day one. There were numerous things. For starters, Mike Ryan had an extensive and violent criminal history. But remember, I told you that when Monsoon did his criminal background search on him, he had entered the wrong birth date and got 0 results. If he had entered the correct information, he would have discovered his lengthy history of violence. He would have been able to investigate those past cases, and he would have found some very troubling facts about Mike Ryan related to his past crimes. One of the most unsettling were the reports that Mike had a proclivity for knives. There were reports that knives were a key component of Mike's crimes. Now, did Mike Ryan actually go back to Mississippi after Bruce kicked him out of his apartment? Perhaps his dad did pay for him to travel back after finding himself homeless and back out on the streets. And after a couple of months of having to deal with Mike again, Dad became fed up and really wanted nothing more to do with trying to help his son anymore. We do know that at some point Mike made his way back to California prior to Dorka's murder. He admitted that he came back. He told Mansu that he left Mississippi with $52 and that he used that money to make his way across the country to end up back in Southern California. We know for a fact that Mike visited Dorka on March 9, 1983, one day before she was murdered. He went there looking for work or money, and Dorka turned him away. And we know this to be a fact because she told Bob later that day or that evening that she did receive an unexpected visit from Bruce's friend Mike. She told him about it, and she told him that she sent him away, telling him that she had nothing for him. And that encounter Dorka had with Mike gave me pause. It's quite chilling when you think about it. It's like, what would Mike's state of mind have been the moment that he decided to take the chance in visiting his friend's mom seeking help or work or money? He had a really good thing going on with Bruce. Here's this guy, a fellow drug addict, who has a pretty good setup all being paid for by his parents. And the both of them regularly went to the Lisker home to do odd jobs and chores, and they would both be paid for their time. But Mike, unable to carry his weight when it came to paying for his own share of the rent, along with other issues that Bruce began noticing about Mike, including his propensity for violence and other troubling behaviors, so he asked him to leave. So Mike has now lost a really good gig that he had going on there, which could have been a pretty big blow to him emotionally and mentally. And then Mike tried to go home to his dad. But knowing that Mike had already been in and out of the foster care system, mental health institutions, and juvenile detentions, it's pretty clear that Mike's parents washed their hands of him a long time ago. How well was it going to work this time around, with Mike trying to land at his dad's house again? Probably not great at all. And how is that going to impact Mike emotionally and mentally? Again, probably not great. So somehow Mike comes up with the idea to go back to California. maybe Mike's dad was just like, here's all the cash I've got in my wallet, just go. And what's in California? Maybe he's thinking he can get back in good favor with Bruce. Maybe he had other connections here in California for a place to stay or for work. Maybe it was more promising than what Mississippi had to offer at the time. So he comes back to California. According to Paul Ingalls, Mike Ryan was so indigent he was resorting to sleeping in carports. So he decided to take a chance on Dorka. She had helped him in the past. Maybe she would be willing to help him again. But he was wrong. She didn't have anything for him. And why would she? She might have likely known that her son and Mike had a falling out and that it didn't end well, and she had been willing to help him out before because he was helping her son, supposedly, pay for a portion of the rent. So in a roundabout way, it helped her out too. She could get some work done, and it would be a little bit of a load off when it came to her son's cost of living. But honestly, let's put ourselves in Dorka's place. She's got her hands full with her own son and all of his problems. And now that Mike was no longer living there with Bruce, she has no interest in helping him. She has enough to worry about without having to take on another charity case. And remember, this woman is 66 years old, raising a 17-year-old. No, she wanted no part of it. And how is that going to affect Mike's state of mind? This yet another rejection from someone who had once been willing to help him? Probably another mental and emotional blow. So what is Mike's go-to response once he's depleted all of his other options? Violence. He was desperate, and Dorka Lisker may have been his last resort. So prior to Dorka's death, Mike was sleeping outdoors. The day of her death, he checked into a cheap motel in Hollywood. Where did he suddenly get the money to rent a motel room? Well, if we believe him to be the one to have robbed and murdered Dorka, then you know the answer. It would explain where Dorka's $150 went. And then the day after the murder, on the 11th of March, Mike purchased a bus ticket back to Mississippi. Again, likely with the money that he stole from Dorka. Detective Monsu did talk to Mike a couple of times. The first time Mike spoke with the detective, he said that he had just arrived in California and that he checked into a motel in Hollywood on the 10th, which is the very day of the murder. Monsu asked him, "What time did you check in?" And he said 11 a.m. If you recall, Bruce's 911 call reporting that his mother had been attacked came into dispatch at 11:26 a.m. If Mike was at that motel, which was 12 miles or 19 kilometers away from the Lisker home, checking it at 11, then that all but eliminates him as having anything to do with the murder. But Detective Monsu, in one of the very few things that he did investigative-wise, did go to the motel that Mike told him that he stayed at and found out that Mike did not check in at 11 a.m. as he initially reported. Motel records indicated that Mike had checked in at 3 p.m., 4 hours later than he told Monsu when they first talked. And this is more than enough time for Mike to make his way from Sherman Oaks to Hollywood. Detective Monsu spoke to Mike again, and this time the conversation was recorded. And he called him out on his lie and his alibi. Monsu said, quote, "See, the other problem that you've got coming here, you say you've checked into that motel on Thursday morning around 11, and dreamers, that would be Thursday the 10th of March, the day of the murder. So that's bullshit. I went to the motel, you checked in, it was 3 in the afternoon. Mike answered, "Yeah, it was somewhere around 3, I don't remember." Caught in a lie, dreamers? Alibi's been completely obliterated. Mike Ryan can no longer account for his whereabouts at the time of the murder, right? So Detective Monsu jumps all over this, doesn't he? I mean, he just called bullshit. Put the pressure on him, right? This kid is only 17 years old. He's a drug addict. He is not going to be able to match wits with a seasoned police officer. Start asking the hard questions. Demand some answers. Hell, go and drag him to the station and interrogate his ass. Nail him to the wall. He had caught this guy in a bold-faced lie. And here he is in California, where he doesn't belong. He was at the scene of the crime, begging for money and work the day before. For God's sakes, check this guy's shoes, match his footprints up, gather up his clothing, check him for injuries on his hands or body. This was a violent fight between Dorka and her attacker. Monsu did these things, right? No, he didn't. He actually did nothing. On that recording, right after Mike admitted, yeah, it was somewhere around 3, I don't remember, Detective Monsu completely abandoned the entire line of questioning and never brought up the lie that he told about checking in at 11 a.m. ever again. He never confronted Mike about his inability to account for his whereabouts at the time of the murder. He just dropped it altogether, and he never picked it up again. This is what Monsu said to Mike after he said he didn't remember. I don't think you would have helped kill his mom. I think Bruce killed his mom. I never thought you killed his mom. When this recorded conversation ended, Detective Monsu never spoke to Mike Ryan again. And Paul Ingalls and Sergeant Gavin would never be able to speak to him either. Mike committed suicide before they would ever have a chance to. In the years following Dorka's murder, Mike continued to commit a series of violent crimes all the way up until he took his own life in 1996, some 13 years after Dorka's murder. If Monsu had run a proper criminal background check, Mike Ryan's name would have lit up all over the place with a bevy of violent incidents in the months and years leading up to Dorka's murder. When the Los Angeles Times investigative reporters, who I'll talk about more in a little bit, when they tracked down Mike Ryan's mom, even she told them that she believed her son was responsible for Dorka's murder. Paul Ingalls was able to speak to Mike's dad, and he too was absolutely convinced that his son was guilty of the murder as well. And Dad even said, when Ryan killed himself, he was happy. Because when he decided to do that, this world suddenly became a safer place. His own dad said that. Dreamers, should we take a moment and let what I've just told you sink in? Let's just put this out there once and for all. I think that we can collectively agree that Mike Ryan is probably the person who murdered Dorka Lisker. I'm convinced of it, and many of you listening might agree. But he's never been looked at thoroughly enough for us to say with 100% certainty. But I'll go out on a limb and say that I'm pretty much 100% certain that Mike did it. But Detective Monsu, for whatever reasons only he could understand or know, decided to not pursue Mike as a suspect, opting to go after Dorka's son, Bruce. And I seriously don't understand why. It's not like some of the other cases where there is no other logical or viable suspects, you know? Sometimes innocent people are investigated and convicted because there's nobody else to be investigated. But that's not the case here. And I'll never be able to fully understand why Monsu decided to pin this crime on Bruce when the evidence said otherwise. Mansu decided the better option was to make the evidence fit by any means necessary. I mean, would it not have been easier and more simple to just go where the evidence takes you? The evidence against Mike Ryan was practically slapping Mansu in the face, yet he chose to ignore it. Even telling Mike that he was going to ignore it and go after Bruce instead. And it was an exceptionally violent crime. I described Dorka's injuries that she suffered, the beating and the stabbing. It was horrific, and it took a very cruel and sadistic individual in order to be able to do that kind of damage to a 66-year-old woman. Didn't Mansu take a look at what the killer did to Dorka and say to himself, I have got to get this maniac off the streets before he hurts someone else? I mean, isn't that policing 101? Keeping us safe? Mansu didn't do that. He was not working with the best interest of the Lisker family in mind. He was not working with the best interest of public safety in mind. Because in going after Bruce for this crime, knowing that there was a more likely suspect out there, not only would go on to rob Bruce of more than a quarter century of his life, he also allowed for a very, very brutal and vicious killer to continue committing violent crimes all the way up until he finally took his own life. From start to finish, in Mike Ryan's 31 years on this earth, about 20 of them were spent harming others. And I don't think we're wrong to hold Detective Mansu responsible, at least in part, for every single crime that Mike Ryan committed and every single person that he harmed after Mansu let him off the hook for Dorka's murder. I want to pause here and talk for a moment about Anthony Mansu's career with the LAPD. I had mentioned before that Dorka Lisker's case was one of his early, if not his first big murder case as a homicide detective. It's been said that the manner in which Mansu handled this case was all an effort on his part to advance his career within the department. I don't exactly know how or why Mansu thought that fabricating evidence and framing an innocent man while letting a sadistic killer go free was a way to go on his climb up the ranks in the department, but whatever. That's what the general thought is when it comes to Mansu's agenda here. The only thing that I can think of is that Mansu had gone on record early on investigating Bruce as the prime suspect in the case, but once murmurings regarding Mike started going around, that Mansu refused to roll back on his initial theory that it was Bruce. I don't know if it was his ego or his resistance to having to admit that his initial theory was wrong. That was what compelled him to refuse to budge. It was just that he said it was Bruce. That was his theory, and by God, he's going to make it stick. I can't say for sure if that's truly Mansu's line of thinking. I'm really just trying to understand why he would find out pretty early on that he might be wrong and not stop and fix it before this spun way out of control beyond the point of no return. That's basically where this went. But what we can deduce from this is that there is something troubling about Mansu, not only as a cop, but as a person. Someone who is in a position of authority, such as this, who would be willing to lie, cheat, and steal his way to a conviction, is someone who is struggling with many issues, not only in his professional life, but likely all aspects of his life. What kinds of issues? I really don't know. I'm not a psychologist. But to me, it sounds like Mansu has a very low opinion of himself and his ability to conduct himself with any measure of integrity and legitimacy. In order to win, he has to cheat, even when he doesn't have to. He's the type of person who always has to be right and absolutely refuses to ever admit that he's wrong or has made a mistake. Being a police officer is an imperfect science, and I have much respect for the work that they do because a part of it is chasing down leads and running into dead ends and starting all over again at square one. There's nothing wrong with that. We would all have so much more respect for an investigator that worked tirelessly to chase down 100 dead ends if it would only take him to the correct answers, as opposed to a cop who made a snap judgment and refused to budge from that, even if all the evidence is telling him that he is wrong. Being proven wrong means that they did their job. The job is to solve a puzzle. Forcing pieces together that don't fit is only a temporary fix. It's not going to stand up to the test of time and scrutiny. The case is going to be disjointed and broken. But because they're in this position of authority, we tell ourselves, well, we have to believe this because Officer so-and-so says it's the truth. Detective Monsu, and any other police officer for that matter who has provided false testimony and false evidence in order to win a conviction, there is one crucial thing that they really don't seem to take into consideration when they are trying to win at all costs. They don't consider what it means and how it feels for a person who is sitting in prison to be convicted of a crime that they truly did not commit. They fail to realize that this person, no matter how many times their appeals get denied, that they are never going to let this go. The wrongfully convicted have the determination and the tenacity to want to prove their truth, and it's going to absolutely outlast and outpersist any single officer who thought that they were going to be able to put this guy away forever and move on to the next case and never give it a second thought. Because I can almost guarantee that the wrongfully convicted inmate is thinking about that officer who put them there every single moment of every single day. Monsu's career did not flourish in the years following Bruce's conviction, not in the ways that Monsu had hoped. And as it probably is not surprising to any of you listening, because based on what we've discussed here thus far about him, Monsu is very much lacking the fundamental character qualities which make for a successful career in law enforcement. Working his way up the ranks in the LAPD was very slow going. Whatever it was going on with him, and I tend to think it's a propensity for failure that stood in his way, or at least his fear or knowledge or the self-awareness that he simply wasn't police officer material, that he was incapable of measuring up, yet he still kept trying and trying. We know that when it came to Bruce's case, Monsu readily took the shortcuts every single chance that he could. But when confronted with a situation that required him to demonstrate his complete competency and ability, meaning that there are no shortcuts, there would be no cutting corners, there would be no cheating his way through it, Monsu struggled mightily. According to the Los Angeles Times, who investigated him on this case, it took Monsu 54 times to pass the oral examination in order to become a supervising detective. 54 times, you guys. I mean, I don't know what the oral exam to become a supervising detective in the LAPD entails, but how many times does an officer have to fail before the department is like, you know what? Maybe this isn't the right line of work for you. The guy failed 53 freaking times when attempting to pass the exam in order to get bumped up to the next level in his career. Monsu called himself a dinosaur. This word just jumped out at me. Based on everything that I've read and everything that I know about this guy, to me, this translates to Monsu seeing himself as a member of the good old boys club that exists or existed in law enforcement departments. one of those old-timey cops that doesn't do things by the book because he thinks he's above that. He does things with no consideration for policy or procedure. He does things as he sees fit. And all of that with some sexism, racism, probably xenophobia and homophobia included in the mix. Mansu's behavior towards others was quite often abrasive. Let's just say that he wasn't exactly a people person. In 1999, a complaint was filed by a citizen who said that he had an encounter with Mansu where the officer aggressively thrust his finger in this man's face. Mansu was talked to by his supervisors who advised him to dial it down a notch. Still in 1999, Mansu's record revealed that he was disciplined for drinking coffee out of a novelty mug with profanity printed on the outside of it. 2 years later, a complaint and a lawsuit was filed by a female African-American sergeant who reported Mansu making racially charged statements. But what came of that was actually in Mansu's favor. She was the one who was disciplined for raising objections about his work performance, but the department eventually settled with her for $1.25 million. Mansu eventually managed to claw his way to the rank of lieutenant, where he was in charge of nearly 4 dozen officers, which was a job he was still at the time the Los Angeles Times was publishing their articles about Bruce's case in 2005. So every few years or so, Mansu would receive a notification that Bruce would be up for parole. And it was at his 1998 hearing, which Bruce did not attend, that Mansu decided to pen that faithful letter explaining what happened to the $150 that I discussed at length. It gets us realizing that every parole notification that came across Mansu's desk, that it nagged at him. He knew what he had done all those years ago. Mansu carried the weight of the Bruce Lisker case around with him every single day. And the fact that he went out of his way to spin a story to explain the only missing piece of the puzzle all those years later is a testament to that. He honestly would have been better off if he had never said anything at all up to that point. How many times did Mansu feel like he needed to keep convicting Bruce? And why in the world would he continue to feel compelled to keep up his lies with more lies? Was he that ignorant and self-absorbed that he never thought any of this would catch up with him? As science and technology in police investigations continued to advance by leaps and bounds all around Detective Mansu, as the world around him kept moving forward, he continued to act like a dinosaur, thinking that he's this veteran officer, he can just file any kind of report that he wants, he can just make all kinds of claims that he feels like making, and he's going to just throw it all at the wall and is just going to stick because he said so. Sorry, detective, this isn't the prehistoric world of policing anymore, Mr. Dinosaur. With Rodney King, the Los Angeles riots, and O.J. Simpson in the rearview mirror of the LAPD, the turn of the millennium was undoubtedly going to be a new era for the department. And here's old Detective Mansu making up false reports in order to keep his conviction record intact. He knew his case against Bruce would crumble in the face of modern policing and contemporary scrutiny, and he was fighting it, and he knew it was a losing battle. Because remember what I said earlier, as much as Mansu had wished that he could lock up Bruce, throw away the key, and never give that kid another thought for the rest of his career or his life, he forgot to factor in this, that Bruce Lisker was going to spend every waking moment, every waking hour, day, month, and year thinking about Detective Andrew Mansu. And fortunately for Bruce, all the elements that were working against Mansu were totally working in favor of Bruce. So this case, with its unlikely trifecta of investigators, Private Investigator Paul Ingalls, Internal Affairs Investigator Sergeant Jim Gavin, and of course Bruce Lisker himself, is slowly starting to come into focus, and mostly importantly for Sergeant Gavin. As his investigation into Bruce's complaint about Monsu went along, it became clear that there was something to Bruce's allegations, and it was deeply troubling for him. And Sergeant Gavin is not that guy who is going to bury this because it's unflattering or unbecoming for the LAPD. So if you listening are troubled or angered by the fact that this sour grape of a cop, Detective Monsu, has been wreaking havoc for decades in the department, I hope you all have a small measure of comfort knowing that next to every sour grape on the vine, there is a nice, sweet, plump, juicy grape that is just bursting with all the good things that you would expect from a sweet, happy grape that has integrity and proper police training. As Sergeant Gavin is working his investigation into Monsu, he is also at the same time investigating the case of Dorka's murder and Bruce's potential involvement in it. He is reviewing all of the work that was done, all of the evidence that was processed, making sure that Monsu crossed all his T's and dotted all his I's. But you know what? It doesn't matter if you crossed all the T's on your untruths and dotted all the I's on all your lies, because it's not going to change what they are. As they were working to dismantle the case against Bruce, Sergeant Gavin came across a huge piece of evidence that nobody ever acknowledged anywhere. In examining the photos taken of Dorka at autopsy, Sergeant Gavin noticed an injury that had never been examined or processed. It was a shoe print on the back of Dorka's head. Shoe prints and blood at the scene walking around is one thing. Bruce, if it was him, could have inadvertently stepped in his mother's blood and left some bloody footprints around the house. That's not what happened. There was only one set of bloody footprints, and Monsu said that those were Bruce's, even though they were never analyzed or tested. Later, testing conducted by Sergeant Gavin proved that the shoe prints excluded Bruce as having been the one to make them. But did that exclude him from being the killer? Maybe, maybe not. We've seen exculpatory evidence explained away many a times. But what about a shoe stomp on Dorka's head? Would it have been Bruce who carelessly stepped on his mom's head as he panicked in on the scene? No. There is no explaining away a shoe impression on someone's head. The killer did that. Of all the shoe prints around the house, this one on Dorka's head could be the one to seal Bruce's fate, or it could set him free. But it was never examined. It was never even really mentioned. Sergeant Gavin wanted that shoe print tested against Bruce's shoes. And this would be the single most important piece of evidence that would either point to or point away from Bruce as being Dorka's killer. But Sergeant Gavin would never have the chance to test that footprint. Someone stepped in and put a full stop to his internal affairs investigation into Detective Monsu. Sergeant Gavin's supervisors did not like the direction his investigation was heading. He was reaching conclusions that they did not want to hear. Sergeant Gavin did not believe Bruce had a fair and reasonable trial, nor did he believe that the jury heard the truth, and Gavin was not mincing words. Bruce Lisker was framed, and Detective Monsu led the charge by falsifying evidence and covering up exculpatory evidence. And just as Gavin was about to turn the results of his investigation over to the office of the district attorney, his commanding officers swooped in and snatched the files and reports right out of his hands and told him, "You're finished." Bruce Lisker is not going anywhere. He is not leaving prison. Are we clear? The powers that be decided that they were going to be the ones to rule on Bruce's case. And they made it crystal clear. Lisker is guilty, and he's going to stay guilty. Sergeant Gavin knew that the report was going to be buried deep in Bruce's files and locked up, and hopefully never brought up ever again. Bruce got the report back on his complaint, which told him his allegations against Monsu were unfounded and denied. For Bruce, by this time, some 22 years or so in prison, was so used to the letdowns that it wasn't a huge surprise. But for Paul Ingalls, he was like, no, this is not going away like this because people in this department want to force it to go away. And that's when Paul decided to blow the lid off the story. He reached out to a couple of reporters at the Los Angeles Times, and not just any reporters. They were award-winning investigative reporters, Scott Glover and Matt Lay. And I'll tell you more about them in a little bit, but just let me jump into their role to finally getting the ball rolling in the right direction for Bruce Lisker. Glover and Lay started off by trying to prove to themselves that Bruce was guilty. They failed. They spent the next 7 months looking into this case, and in a stunning decision, Sergeant Gavin decided to put his entire career on the line by sharing what he uncovered during his internal affairs investigation with the Times reporters. He really couldn't explain why he simply didn't leave it alone. And his career did suffer as a result of his role in the story, and I'll come back to that too. The one person Glover and Lay needed to talk to was the person who prosecuted Bruce's case, now retired Deputy District Attorney Philip Rabichow. He had agreed to meet with the reporters, and they did at a restaurant in November of 2004. And when they were done with him, retired prosecutor Rabichow came away with a very real concern that he might have prosecuted the wrong person for Dorka's murder. And you know that the LAPD is watching and knowing what these two nosy reporters were doing snooping around on the department. So just before Glover and Lay were on the verge of publishing their explosive article, someone with the department contacted them with some news. They tested the footprint on Dorka's head, and it was a match to Bruce Lisker's shoes. And well, a little more digging revealed, and you guessed it, the print on her head was never tested against Bruce Lisker's shoe. Eventually it was, and surprise, surprise, it did not belong to Bruce. We all knew that that was going to be the case, but the prosecutor, Rabichow, he was absolutely astonished at what he was finding out all these years later. It was really troubling for him to think that he possibly put an innocent man away for a crime that he may not have committed. All he could say was that he relied on the detective's investigation to build his case, which I guess is understandable. He really had no reason to question what he was being told about Bruce Lisker. The prosecutor's job is not to investigate the crime itself. It's his job to prosecute it. He depends on law enforcement to do the investigating, and he works with what he's told. Well, a little more than 22 years after Dorka's life was so violently taken, on May 22, 2005, Glover and Lay published their article in the Los Angeles Times exposing the dubious investigation conducted by Andrew Monsu in Bruce's case and the questionable evidence Monsu presented at trial and at his parole hearing 15 years later. And guess what happened next? 12 days later, on Friday, June 3rd, 2005, the then Lieutenant Andrew Monsu, at the age of 57, put in his last day as the LAPD supervisor of the Central Division. He decided to retire within days of the expose, and his last official day as a member of the LAPD would be July 9th, 2005. Monsu had been with the department for 31 years and has worked on more than 1,000 murder cases. And considering what we know about his conduct in Bruce's case, it's pretty concerning. I'm sure for the LAPD, who could quite possibly be facing a litany of complaint filings from any of those 1,000+ cases Monsu was involved in, Mansu's retiring came as a welcome blessing. Maybe retiring before he could be fully investigated helped prevent that kind of fallout. And not every case is as tainted as Bruce Lisker's was, but the reality is that any case that Mansu touched has the potential of having been tainted. But when Bruce was prosecuted, Mansu was not the only witness who testified on behalf of the prosecution against Bruce. There was that jailhouse informant that I told you about earlier, Robert Hughes, the one who had claimed that while he was being housed in the cell next door, Bruce confessed the entire murder to him in full detail, even calling Bruce a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Well, it turns out, in their investigation into this, Times reporters Glover and Lay discovered what is known as the snitch tank. It is a cell next door to a cell that houses a person who is able or willing to testify that the person in the cell next to them confessed their crime. Glover and Lay discovered that over a period of 18 months, including the time that Bruce spent in that cell, Robert Hughes reported that he was told no less than 3 full-blown confessions to murder. And as a reward for his testimony at Bruce's trial, Hughes had a couple of months shaved off his sentence. That's what Bruce Lisker's life was worth to this man. A couple of months. Well, as much as I love dwelling on the wrongdoings of others, Bruce is a better person than that and continued to press forward in his fight to have his truth be told and believed. And after all the years of fighting for it, the game changer would ultimately be Glover and Lay and their LA Times investigative report. In July of 2005, a federal judge granted Bruce what he had been hoping for all these years: a new hearing so he and his attorney could present new evidence in the case against him. When he got the news, his thoughts immediately went to being on the other side of prison walls. Now, the task at hand was going to be to prove to the satisfaction of the judge that a jury would not be able to find him guilty today. And the means of going about that would be to discredit all the evidence against him. Thus far, they've discredited a lot of it, right? The shoe prints that Mansu insisted were Bruce's were proven to not be. The other suspect's lies and inability to provide an alibi. The blood or lack of blood on Bruce's t-shirt. The lies Mansu told about the missing money. Even Rabachow's own nagging feeling that Mike Ryan needed to be looked at more thoroughly. But there was one last thing that Mansu asserted in his testimony, that it would have been impossible for Bruce to have seen his mom through the living room window and through the dining room window the way that he claimed to have. Now, I never believed what Mansu was trying to say about all this. I totally believed that Bruce could have seen his mom and always felt that the way Mansu presented this was somewhat truncated to fit how he wanted it to fit. He glanced in at a window, saw a glare, took a pic, and said no, impossible. He went to the other window, saw a planter that obscured part of the vantage point, and again decided no, Bruce was lying. That is terrible police work of the highest order. How do you just glance inside and make that decision? By the time Mansu got there, Dorka had already been transported to the hospital. Who's to even say he did the testing at the same time of day or the day after that? Or did he just go and make this flippant determination based on the time that he arrived there, not the time that Bruce got there? The trajectory of the sun changes with each passing minute. And I seriously doubt Mansu went above and beyond to duplicate Bruce's actions the following day so he could make the determination at the same time of day. Well, Mansu testified as to his findings, and it was all backed up by the prosecutor telling the jury that it was Bruce Lisker's biggest lie. Now, reporters Glover and Lay had already done their recreations at the home on the same time of year and the same time of day that the crime happened. But Paul, Bruce's attorney, attorneys from the district attorney's office, they needed to do their own recreation of what Bruce said he saw and did. They went to the first window, again, same time of year, same time of day, that Bruce had done all those years earlier. They had a model set up lying on the floor in the same place Dorka had been found, and while they stood in the window that Monsu had said had too much of a glare to see anything inside, they were able to see the model's feet, just as Bruce had said. Then they went around to the dining room window, which Prosecutor Rabichow told the jury would have been impossible for Bruce to have seen any part of his mom's body, and clearly they were able to see the top of the model's head. Rabichow himself needed to see this in person. Philip Rabichow had retired from the DA's office in 2003 and never really gave much thought to Bruce Lisker, though he was the one who prosecuted him back in 1985 for the murder of his mom. He really didn't look back at much of anything when it came to his career with the DA's office. He believed in his heart that Bruce was guilty, and he believed it because that's what Detective Monsu told him, that Bruce was responsible, and provided him with all of the evidence and reasoning as to why it was as such. But as Rabichow got to talking to reporters Glover and Lay, and started seeing that some of the facts of the case he once believed were true suddenly started to crumble under the weight of scrutiny, he began to worry a lot. To a point, it began costing him sleepless nights as he lay there thinking about Bruce's trial, going over everything in an attempt to assure himself that he did the right thing, that he prosecuted the right person. Though it was eating away at him, as all the evidence against Bruce was being dismantled piece by piece, there was still one element that remained standing, that Bruce lied about seeing his mom through the windows of the home. But he simply couldn't rely on Monsu's word anymore. Rabichow had to go and see for himself. If he finds that he was wrong about this, then it would confirm what he had been dreading, that he perhaps convicted an innocent man. Once Rabichow left that meeting with Glover and Lay, Bruce's case shattered the peace and tranquility of his retirement. His every waking moment was consumed as he attempted to digest the fact that the case that he had so thoroughly believed in wasn't anything that he once thought it was. He began going back over the case all over again, the entire thing. He went back to the DA's office and pulled out his entire case file on Bruce Lisker, dusted it off, and went through all of it. And another piece of evidence that nobody even really knew jumped out at him from the pages of his dusty old files, something that never even came up at any point in the investigation, the trial, or beyond. It was a phone call made from the landline at the Lisker home very close to the time that Dorka was attacked. Someone dialed the phone number to Mike Ryan's mother's house, but the phone call was not answered, or it was hung up before anyone had the chance to answer. So this may have possibly provided the manner in which an assailant may have gained entry into the Lisker home. For example, if Mike Ryan went over there and asked to use the phone as a way of being invited in, and Dorka, trusting the young man, let him in, he picked up the phone, he dialed the number, and it connected because it was on the phone records. But Mike's intentions were not to call his mom, but use the phone call as a ruse to get inside and attack Dorka. At the time of trial, Bruce's attorney was prohibited from bringing up any evidence involving Mike Ryan. But Rabichow did hang on to the fact that he believed Bruce would not have been able to see his mom through those windows as he had claimed. And if Bruce was lying about seeing his mom's body, and that is what caused him to try and gain entry into the home, then he could not be believed in any other aspects of his story. Rabichow himself had never visited the Lisker home. He relied solely on the word of Detective Monsu. Reporters Glover and Lay asked him if he wanted to go. They'd already been there. They talked to the homeowner, who was more than happy to allow them access to the property, and they were welcomed back any time they needed. ORBITAL said that he would go. In March of 2005, close to the date that Dorka was attacked 22 years before, they all would do this experiment at the same time of day once again. Some of the entryway of the hall where Dorka lay had been removed or renovated, but they reconstructed it to the exact measurements that were taken by the police all those years earlier, and they replicated the way Dorka was laying. Based on his knowledge of the crime scene, ORBITAL was satisfied that their setup was accurate. They went outside the home, and ORBITAL stood at the windows that Bruce stood at the moment he realized that something was wrong with his mom. ORBITAL was able to clearly see the head and feet of the model laying on the floor inside the home. He took a deep breath, and he stood there quietly, looking at the body on the floor from outside. He finally said that he should have come there. The wheels of justice turn painfully slow, don't they? Yes, a federal judge said that there would be a hearing a couple of months after Glover and Lay's scathing investigative report hit the newsstands. But it would take several years before a judge would actually render his ruling. But it finally did happen in August of 2009. A federal judge ruled that Bruce had been tried and convicted on falsified evidence and ordered that he be given a new trial or set him free. August of 2009. That is more than 26 years after Dorka was killed. Half of Bruce's life plus 9 years. That's how long it took for him to finally be heard and believed. But the DA was like, yeah, no, we're going back to trial. Don't get used to freedom, Bruce. Well, no matter, Bruce was ready for the fight, and he didn't care. He was ordered to be released on bail, so on August 13th, 2009, Bruce finally left the confines of the prison walls for the first time in 26 years. Paul Ingalls was there to give him a ride to wherever Bruce wanted to go. 6 weeks later, Bruce was headed back to court for a hearing about his possible retrial. We can only imagine what or how Bruce was feeling at this time, but I'm pretty sure he was so ready to fight this with all the evidence that he now had. But the DA, he kind of showed up empty-handed. What did that mean? Well, it meant exactly what it looked like. They knew they had nothing on Bruce, so they brought nothing. That's not exactly what the DA said. He said something along the lines of, while they are convinced of Bruce's guilt, that he is the person who murdered his own mother, that too many years have gone by to bring this case back into court, so they decided to drop the charges. And with that, Bruce Lisker was free. In January of 2016, the city of Los Angeles agreed to pay Bruce a settlement of $7.6 million for his wrongful imprisonment. Today, Bruce is happily married. He's a consultant, a motivational speaker, a web designer, and a volunteer with Inside Out Writers, which is an LA-based nonprofit that conducts weekly writing classes in juvenile halls. And from what all I can see on Bruce's website and social medias, life is good. And what about Sergeant Gavin? Well, his career was certainly derailed by his desire to want to see the wrongdoing of the LAPD made right. It would go on to cost him dearly in terms of his upward mobility within the LAPD. The conduct of officers within the department was the reason why Bruce's case came across Sergeant Gavin's desk. He opened up an investigation into Monsu because that was his job. But as the investigation was going places that his superiors did not like, they pulled the rug out from under him and aborted his entire investigation. And in doing so, this called into question as to whether or not they acted within the policies and guidelines of the LAPD when it comes to internal affairs investigations, especially when it came to Sergeant Gavin's findings that Monsu may have improperly and hastily dismissed Mike Ryan as a suspect in the Lisker murder investigation, as well as the possibility that Monsu lied about being told that the $150 was found by the new owners of the Lisker home. Of course, Monsu denied that he had done anything wrong and retired when the media got a hold of the story. And not only was Sergeant Gavin told that he was done with the investigation that he was conducting, he was transferred to another department and came to be under investigation himself for communicating his findings to Bruce's defense team. He was also told that this was internal affairs and it was not their job to investigate homicides. Sergeant Gavin would eventually move up in rank to lieutenant, but he filed a complaint against the department nonetheless, asserting that he was retaliated against by way of stifling his career because of his investigation into Monsu. The LAPD would say that Gavin had no business sticking his nose into a homicide investigation, and in doing so, he was in violation, going into areas of work of which he was not qualified to do. Sergeant Gavin lost his lawsuit against the department. Despite the fact that he's now been all but ostracized within the department, it didn't matter to him. If he had to do it all over again, knowing what he knows now, he'd do the same. Because to him, this is a thing that should have never happened. And where does all of this sit with retired prosecutor Philip Rabichow? Well, as troubling as almost everything he prosecuted Bruce on has turned out to be, there was still one thing that bothered him. Remember the window that Bruce said that he climbed in order to enter the home once he realized something was wrong with his mom? Well, Rabichow can't help but feel like the manner in which he entered the home was more indicative of someone who was attempting to sneak into the home, not someone in a panic trying to help his mom. And whether or not Bruce was the one who killed his mom, all Rabichow could say was he simply can't know for sure. And as for Andrew Monsu, he has refused to speak publicly about Bruce Lisker. He has never been held accountable for any of his misconduct as a police officer with the LAPD. In June of 2005, shortly after he announced his retirement from the LAPD, according to his LinkedIn profile, he went to work as a security manager for Harbor Freight Tools, and he stayed there until April of 2010. Bruce Lisker entered into the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation at the age of 17. His life wasn't exactly on the right path, but most of what he was involved in was largely self-destructive. He wasn't trying to cause his family any hurt or pain, though he probably did. No one wants to see their children struggle the way Bruce had been. And until the day that she was murdered, Dorka Lisker did the best that she could to care for her one and only. And the same went for Bob. Until the day a heart attack ended his life, he too stood by his son. His faith in him was never shaken. Bruce was robbed of so many things, starting with the murder of his mother, who was likely killed by a person that Bruce brought into their lives. Though Bruce isn't to blame for what ultimately happened, it is likely that he holds himself responsible for ever trusting a person like Mike Ryan. Bruce was not on a path towards much of anything. He was using drugs. He had dropped out of school, couldn't find work. He was going nowhere fast. So we will never know what would have become of him if this had never happened. But he certainly did not deserve this. And that brings this 121st episode of California Dreaming to a close. I would encourage you to come over to our Facebook discussion group if you haven't done so yet and request to join. It is there we discuss the cases we cover, we share our thoughts and opinions, not only about our show, but other podcasts that you listen to, documentaries that you've watched, books that you've read, as well as current news stories, posts about your pets, funny memes, anything you feel like sharing, please come on over. You can also go to the show's Facebook page and like that page and leave a review or a recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. This week, I would like to wish a happy birthday to Zelma K on the 10th, Adria and Diane M on the 12th, Carlene A on the 14th, and Kaja B on the 15th. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company that's on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to, with an amazing roster of shows with content including true crime, history, sports entertainment, gaming, and social media. So visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. There you can find links to all of our podcasts, as well as a direct link to our merchandise store on TeePublic. Again, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams.